many games will the Minnesota Vikings win in 2024? Skol! That's what you guys do, right? What's up, Vikings fans? It's Mitch here to give you a record prediction, a schedule breakdown, and my overall thoughts on the Vikings for 2024. A breakdown of the toughest matchups, the weakest teams that you will play, and I will say, the Vikings have a pretty tough schedule. So this is going to be an interesting season for Vikings fans because they're used to competing. They're used to at least being in the realm of the playoffs. But this is a different year in terms of narrative, in terms of outlook, and in terms of expectations. Because rookie quarterback, right? Maybe at least for half the year at least, right? So the Vikings are kind of one of those strange teams where I really like what they did in the offseason. I think, honestly, they have a pretty good roster, and I've talked about this before, but it's going to be interesting to see what people actually expect from this team because with a young quarterback, with a young team, with a lot of turnover and almost a rebuilding phase, it's going to be difficult to judge the success of this season. So let's talk about it. Gronk spike the like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more record predictions just like this, including all 32 NFL teams. And drop in the comments section and let me know your thoughts, your expectations, and your record for the Vikings in 2024. Let's break down this schedule, baby. So, let's begin with week number 1, where the Vikings take on the Giants in New York. And if you were going to play the Giants this year, which the Vikings obviously are in week 1, I would say for any team, it would be a much easier game if it were at the end of the year. Because I think the Giants are going to be one of those teams that kind of unfolds and becomes sort of a disaster near the end of the year. Sort of like last year. I don't think people recognize that the Giants early in the year are going to be pretty competitive because Brian Daboll's a good coach. I like the defensive coordinator hire. They did upgrade at receiver with Malik Neighbors. The offensive line is a little bit better. And with Daniel Jones there, they're going to give one last kind of gasp, one last effort in putting forth a competitive team. Right? This is the team, the Giants, that beat the Vikings 2 years ago in the playoffs. And that game was in Minnesota. So the Giants very well could beat Minnesota again. But the difference for me is Minnesota has a much better defense than they did back then. I mean, the Vikings had arguably the best improvement on defense despite a lack of personnel last year among any team in football. I think Brian Flores is brilliant, and he's one of the best defensive coordinators in football. And they have definitely upgraded some of their front seven for sure. And I definitely think they're light years better than 2 years ago, especially in that playoff game in terms of their defense, not their offense, but their defense. So when looking at this matchup, I think the difference is the defense. I think the Vikings go to New York, and if it's Sam Darnold, I feel a lot more confident because at least I kind of know what he is, and he's a veteran, and he played in New York. So there's a little bit of like, okay, it's kind of a revenge scene for him a little bit, but also like it's just a veteran. He can get the ball where it needs to go. Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, Aaron Jones running the ball. Like the Giants don't have a very good secondary. I do think their front seven is pretty darn good and their run defense could be pretty solid. So it might be hard to run on them. And that's another reason why JJ McCarthy might not be the best guy to start early, but if they really believe in JJ, hey, I mean, go for it. I'm not really going to rule against it, but maybe they want him to sit. I'm not exactly sure yet. But defensively, I think it's the reason they're going to win because I think Flores is one of those guys that's very aggressive and is going to come up with a game plan that messes with Daniel Jones. Like, I think he's going to be under pressure, under duress all day. The new offensive line will have their head spinning. I think they're going to be able to slow down the Giants' running game without Saquon Barkley. And I think they're going to win the game because they just have better overall coaching. And I think their defense is just going to be after it. So, and Jefferson will probably make a few plays against a pretty bad secondary. So I got the Vikings to win in week 1. After that, though, it gets really tough. Obviously, the Vikings beat the Niners last year, but that might have been the best Kirk Cousins game I've ever seen him play against a premier team, and for the Vikings, maybe. I mean, like, that game was unreal. He was unreal. He looked like Tom Brady in that game. Like, honestly, Now, it is in Minnesota, which certainly helps. At least you don't have to go to San Francisco, but the Niners are just way better. I mean, like, the Niners are just the Niners. Like, they're probably the best team in the NFC. They might have the best roster and one of the best coaches in the league. And, I mean, their offense is brilliant. Their defense is loaded. It's going to be really hard to win that game 2 years in a row. And they're probably going to have a little bit of anger because they lost last year in Minnesota. So there's a little bit of revenge there as well. Then in week 3, they play, in my opinion, one of the best teams in football as well, the Houston Texans. I have to pick the Texans. I think the Texans are one of those teams, too, that's going to be really hard for the Vikings because they're a dome team. So they're not going to be, like, out of sorts in the dome of Minnesota because they play in a dome already. They're a high-octane offense. They can run the ball. They can throw the ball. They've got a multitude of weapons. They've got a young, studly quarterback who's really good against pressure, not like Daniel Jones. They've got a defense that has a good pass rush, and they don't really have to blitz that much to get pressure. And they were very good against the run last year. So to me, the Texans are just a very complete team, very well coached. And I don't think the Vikings will have the coaching edge in that game. I think both coaching staffs kind of come from a similar tree, and it will make for a pretty competitive game. But I feel like the Texans just have way more talent, especially at quarterback and defense. So week number 4, the Packers in Green Bay. Again, like, really tough game. You play like 3 of the best teams, arguably 5 of the best teams in the league. You look at this stretch right at the beginning of the year. You play the Giants, who suck, kind of. Not really, but, I mean, by the end of the year, I think they'll suck. Then you play arguably the best team in the NFC, arguably the hottest pick in terms of, like, dark horse contender in the Texans. You pick Green Bay, who went to the divisional round last year, and people expect to be even better this year. You play the Jets, who have arguably the most talented defense in the NFL, and they have Aaron Rodgers. Then you have a bye week. Then you have Detroit, who went to the NFC Championship last year, and some people think they can win the Super Bowl this year. Then you play Matthew Stafford in LA with the Rams and Sean McVay. Then you play the Colts. Then you play Jacksonville. Neither are easy games either. I mean, this is an insanely hard stretch to start the schedule. So I'm looking at this, and I'm like, they're probably going to win like one game going into the bye week. They're probably going to lose to Green Bay. Maybe they could upset the Jets in Minnesota. That's maybe the game where in Minnesota, the power of the dome could take over. But the Jets defense is really good. Now, can Kevin O'Connell kind of drop a game plan? If this is a Sam Darnold start, maybe it's a Sam Darnold revenge game against the Jets. But, man, I just don't know. Like, Aaron Rodgers typically beat the Vikings throughout the course of his career. The Jets do have a pretty good weapon base. Garrett Wilson. Now they added Mike Williams. They've got Breece Hall who can run it. The O-line is much improved. I think Flores maybe could get after Rodgers, but the thing is, Rodgers is so quick and so good at deciphering blitzes that it's going to be hard for them to win that matchup unless, like, the O-line of the Jets is just worse than expected this year, but we'll see. I don't know. Like, the Vikings could win, but I'm going to go with the Jets. They're just much more talented. They're one of the most talented teams in football. The way the Vikings can win is through coaching. Now, they've got the bye week, and then they've got the Lions. I think that after the bye, at home against the Lions, they'll win. Okay? I don't think they're better than the Lions. Don't get me wrong. The Lions are certainly a better team, which I'll have them win the last game of the season and split with the Lions. But bye week, you get to fix some things. Maybe you turn from Sam Darnold to, depending on what happens, right, in week 5 there against the Jets, maybe you go from Sam Darnold to JJ in week 7. So maybe there's a little bit of a curveball there. But I think that the recognition, the familiarity between the teams, I think the way that Flores' defensive scheme operates against Jared Goff is a good way to disrupt Jared Goff, because Goff is not good when he has to move or like move out of his spot. He gets very rattled and can play pretty poorly at times. The Vikings, I think, will also be pretty good against the run. And then on the other side of things, they've got a lot of weapons, Minnesota, and the Lions can't really match up with all those weapons in the passing game. So I think the Lions can definitely get upset there. Then in week 8, you play in Los Angeles on a short week. That's a really tough game. Short week on a Thursday against the Rams. It is O'Connell against McVay, right? It's kind of teacher and pupil type of thing. But, I mean, the advantage at quarterback in that game is so big that it's hard to overcome. Matthew Stafford in his building against whoever the Vikings have at quarterback. Week 9, they play the Colts. I think they're going to upset the Colts at home. I think that the way that the Vikings, again, play defense, where I think they're going to be able to corral a running quarterback like Anthony Richardson. I think they're going to be able to speed up his process, potentially force a couple mistakes. And then I think offensively, they've got great receivers against one of the worst cornerback groups in football. So I think the Vikings match up really well with the Colts, and they're also at home. Then in week 10, I think they'll lose to Jacksonville, who's a pretty good team overall. Trevor Lawrence, I think, will have a bounce-back season. I like Doug Peterson. I like their defense overall. I don't think it's fantastic, but it's pretty solid. They've improved their team overall, and Jacksonville is always one of those weird places to play. Tennessee could be a game that the Vikings can win, so I'm going to get back to that game. Week 12, the Vikings play in Chicago. I think they'll probably lose in Chicago and win at home. So we're going to go, especially considering the game that they play at home is on Monday night. So there's a pretty decisive advantage with the home crowd, with the lit nature of a Monday Night Football game. But Caleb Williams, J.J. McCarthy, potentially a rookie matchup there. I think the Vikings have a better offensive line than the Bears. I think that the weapons are pretty similar on both sides. And I think that the Bears probably have a more fundamentally sound defense, but the Vikings do a lot of creative stuff. So those two teams could probably split. Last year's games were very close, so I could see something pretty similar as last year. So I think one team will win each game at home. Then we've got the Cardinals at home. I think the Vikings should beat the Cardinals. Again, I like how Flores is able to corral those mobile quarterbacks through blitzing and different blitz angles, bringing guys from the secondary. That being said, I also think the Cardinals' defense is also pretty weak, and getting them at home, I think the Vikings can control the ball. Potentially Aaron Jones could have a big game here running the ball, help protect their young quarterback, and get the ball to their weapons. The Cardinals probably have the easiest defense they'll face all year. And then Atlanta also has a pretty weak defense as well the week following. That's also in Minnesota, which could be a game that Minnesota pulls it off against Kirk Cousins, but I am going to lean towards Kirk Cousins getting his quote-unquote revenge on the Vikings, although I don't really think it's a revenge game. But it is Cousins in a very meaningful, emotional game for him. And I think that the Falcons, the edge that they have in terms of quarterback and the experience of Cousins over probably J.J. McCarthy, that will be a very cool scene and a very cool game to watch because of the generational impact on Vikings fans. But I ultimately think the Falcons will win a shootout maybe in that game. Then in week 16, the Seahawks in Seattle is always a very difficult game, especially for a young quarterback. I'm going to take Seattle. Mike McDonald's got a great defensive scheme. I really like the Seahawks' weapons, and they could be a big problem for the Vikings secondary. And then week 17, the Packers at home. I think the Vikings will pull off one game against the Packers. Why not? So I'll say they win that game in week 17. And then the last game to determine everything is the game against Tennessee. I'm pretty sure. Am I getting one wrong? Because I thought I had them at 6-11. No, I think I'm on it. I think I got this right. So I think I had Tennessee beating Minnesota, but that's a potential swing game for them to go 7-10 potentially. But they could also go 6-11. That's sort of the range I see for Minnesota regardless. Tennessee's an interesting team. I think they'll be a lot better on offensive line this year. I think Will Levis will be a complete wild card, very much like Minnesota's quarterback play. They both have very good sets of weapons at receiver. Tennessee's got good corners to match up with the Vikings, though. So the Vikings are going to have to go to Tennessee and run the ball a little bit. But to me, I think the Vikings are in a little bit of a rebuilding phase. I think their future is really bright because I really like Kevin O'Connell. I really like Brian Flores if he can stick around. I love what they've done with the offensive line. I think the receiving core is really talented. Aaron Jones will probably be only around for a year or two, but I think they've got a lot of fundamentals down pat. It's a matter of, did they hit with that pick on J.J. McCarthy? If not, you can always adjust. It's not like they really gave up a lot. But I think this year is sort of a transition year to get JJ some reps, get him going. Sam Darnold might play a little bit, see what he has, if he has anything left as that first-round pick that he once was. But honestly, I think the Vikings, you should expect similar results to last year. It will just be less chaotic at the quarterback position. Probably still pretty tough to watch, but less chaotic on who's starting on a weekly basis with the injury to Cousins. That was crazy last year for the Vikings. I think you'll similarly see games where they outcoach the other team and they win. There'll be games where they outcoach the other team and they just slightly lose. I think the defense will show up in quite a few games, but I think the defense can also be had in certain games as well. So, I mean, this is an interesting team. I really like the Vikings. I think that their future, again, I really like it for them. It's just this year, I see them as a suffering team in terms of they just don't have the quarterback to really get things done the way they want. So, Gronk, spike the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know what you think of the Vikings season. How good do you think they'll be? Do you think I'm too low? Do you think I'm too high? What's your record for Minnesota this year? Thanks, guys, for watching. It's Mitch. Gronk, spike the like button. See you in the next one. Peace.